Hello YouTube gang, how you doing? Hope everyone's well. Welcome back to this video series on legendary political activist James O'Keefe and his organisation Project Veritas. In the last video we looked at James's origin story, how he developed his political view of the world, his first forays into activism, and we ended on one of his biggest career achievements to date, his recordings of the community organising group Acorn, which paved the way for Acorn to go into liquidation and turned James into a star of the political right. This vid will pick up from where that last one left off, with James flying high, riding on that success. So without further ado, we're going to run the intro and then we'll get back into the life of James O'Keefe.
I would sue you. You do it again, and I will.
That shit was fire though.
2010 was the year where Project Veritas as we know it today was born, with initial funding for the organisation coming from conservative media mogul Andrew Breitbart. Breitbart had struck up a business partnership with James O'Keefe after their work together circulating the Acorn videos. In many ways, the two were like-minded souls, committed to changing political discourse through disruptive tactics and radical strategies. Breitbart had a grand vision for James as a new type of conservative activist, one who would start a citizen journalist revolution and turn the tables on the liberal powers that be. James O'Keefe had quickly risen as a star of conservatism and was embraced with open arms by the Tea Party movement, who saw his camera operations as a novel way to combat the liberal establishment. However, not everyone had been impressed by his Acorn sting. In James's book Breakthrough, he describes a random encounter he has in the street with a man called Andy Bichlbaum. Andy had been part of an activist group called the Yes Men, who rose to prominence doing audacious media stunts where they lampooned big lobbying groups and corporations. The Yes Men impersonated spokespeople from industries like big oil and pharmaceuticals and delivered strange monologues which satirized their callous corporate views. In one of Andy's most famous hoaxes, he managed to fool the BBC into interviewing him as a representative of Dow Chemicals, and on behalf of Dow Chemicals, he proceeded to take full responsibility for a gas leak the company had caused 20 years previously in Bhopal, which exposed 500,000 people to a toxic gas. Andy promised Dow Chemicals would give $12 billion to the victims.
Today is a great day for all of us at Dow. It's 20 years since the disaster, and today I'm very happy to announce that for the first time Dow is accepting full responsibility for the Bhopal catastrophe. We have a $12 billion plan to finally, at long last, fully compensate the victims, including the 120,000 who may need medical care for their entire lives. I would also like to say that this is no small matter, Steve. This is the first time in history that a publicly owned company of anything near the size of Dow has performed an action which is significantly against its bottom line simply because it's the right thing to do.
Dow Chemical stock dropped by $2 billion as a result of this fake interview. James O'Keefe praises Andy Bichlbaum from the Yes Men as a mischievous, creative genius and describes him as one of his biggest inspirations. In the passage he writes in his book, when he sees Andy on the street, he's very excited to introduce himself as the guy behind the Acorn stings. In pure groupie mode, I approached him, introduced myself, and told him the truth. He had helped inspire me to do investigations on Planned Parenthood and Acorn. He looked at me like I was a child molester. I didn't inspire you, he spit out. What you did hurt people. Why did you do that? At first, I thought he was just punking me, and I was prepared to join in on the gag, but the look in his eyes gave away the game. There was no irony here at all. I was forced to confront one of my heroes, in the flesh, actually hating me. Thrown unexpectedly on the defensive, I explained to him that I didn't defund Acorn, Obama had. Bichlbaum wasn't buying. He looked at me with total contempt, then turned and walked away without the slightest recognition that I was worth even a so long. Although James is understandably hurt by this rejection, it brings him to a very important realization. The people who dislike him are agenda-driven ideologues. Instantly, I knew how Dorothy felt when she pulled back the curtain. The Yes Men were not true Alinskyeites, not at all. Nor were they tacticians or even natural pranksters. They are agenda-driven ideologues. This passage is interesting because James seemed to totally be in admiration of Andy's work until Andy said he didn't like James's Acorn sting, At which point Andy becomes nothing but an ideologically biased hack who's also a bad tactician and doesn't even have a natural affinity for pranking people. That last one seems a bit harsh. He seems pretty good at pranking. I think the treatment that James received after the Acorn sting at the hands of the media, the liberal establishment, and people like Andy Bicklebom certainly exacerbated a binary view of people in James's mind, where they could be neatly categorized as supporters or enemies of Project Veritas. So, let's talk about Project Veritas' first operations in 2010. In the final months of the previous year, a debate had been raging in the US about Obama's Affordable Health Care Act, which we now know as Obamacare. Republicans and Tea Party activists were not happy about the proposed legislation, and they launched a phone campaign to pressure senators not to vote for the bill. The senators hit hardest by this campaign were Democrats in states which had big contingencies of right-wing voters, such as Louisiana, where a Democratic senator called Mary Landrieu was in office. Many Tea Party activists were complaining that their calls weren't getting through to Landrieu's phone.
Landrieu's office was criticized for not answering the phone as she mulled over her decision on the health care bill. Landrieu even told the Baton Rouge Advocate, "Our lines have been jammed for weeks, and I apologize."
James O'Keefe had his suspicions that Mary Landrieu was lying about her phones, so he rounded up a crew of like-minded associates, man like Stan Dye, Robert Flanagan, shout out to Joseph Basil, and James O'Keefe said, "Right guys, it's time for a classic Project Veritas undercover mission."
Let's go, in and out, 20 minutes adventure.
The plan was simple. James would dress up as a young Democrat, button-down shirt, khakis, indistinguishable from the nerds you'd find working in politics at such a young age. Meanwhile, James's accomplices would don the attire of casual repairmen, denim, yellow jackets, hard hats, assuming the natural authority which society reserves uniquely for, salt-of-the-earth working-class legends. James and his associates would enter Landrieu's building and use their disguises as cover to interrogate members of Landrieu's team about whether or not the phones were working. It would lead to an easy confession that Landrieu was lying about the phone thing, and the phones were perfectly operational. Along the way, James could find opportunities to bait staffers into having more derogatory conversations about Republicans and the Tea Party, adding more fuel to the fire which could be used against the Democrats in upcoming election campaigns. With one stroke, James and his crew of cunning infiltrators would debunk the phone myth and embarrass Landrieu and the Democrat hacks in the process. So, James and his friends arrive in the building. They get through the metal detectors, and James's friend tapes a camera the size of a pin to the top of his hard hat. James gets to the reception area of Mary Landrieu's office and sits down on a sofa, and then in come his friends in repairman outfits, Robert and Joseph. Joseph immediately announces,
We're looking to fix the phones.
In his book, James identifies this as an immediate foolish mistake. Joseph was supposed to say, "We've gotten complaints the phone lines were tied up and no one can get through." If he had made that comment, he would have left enough room for it to be interpreted as a literal depiction of phone lines being busy, which might have prompted the staffers to say something about the morons in the Tea Party being the ones behind it. But the comment he actually made, "We're looking to fix the phones," gave only one plausible reading, that the phone lines were literally broken. As the conversation unravels, James describes feeling deeply uncomfortable but having no way to intervene as Joseph dives headfirst into this detailed bullshit conversation about the central telephone closet and how the phone problem might be fixed by looking in there. Joseph doesn't even have any tools with him, so he's making himself increasingly vulnerable to getting discovered. Unable to sit by any longer, James jumps into the conversation, saying,
You know, with all those teabaggers calling in those complaints, maybe that's the reason the phones aren't working, right?
decisively sweeping the conversation back towards Republicans with the hope that the Democrats listening to him might follow his lead and start insulting the Tea Party on camera. Robert and Joseph look at him like he's an alien, and James describes this as the moment where things really start to go downhill. Another staffer comes out, described by James as looking annoyed and having big shoulders and a bad attitude. She guides Joseph and Robert directly out of reception to speak to someone in the hallway, and the person she's taken them to is the guy who's in charge of maintenance for the whole federal building. He probably knows all the utility workers who work in the building, and he knows that in front of him are two random boys in hard hats who've merely assumed the role of the working class hero, unlike him who was born into the role of the working class hero. James is left sitting in the lobby. He writes, "While I knew we had gone way off script, I did think it was catastrophic. I waited a minute, looked up, and saw the rest of the staffers giggling at each other." They're not telephone repairmen, the receptionist said to a balding bureaucrat in the next cubicle. They both laughed about it. So James is all like,
Oh man. Oh God. Oh man. Oh God. Oh man. Oh God. Oh man. Oh God.
and he decides to make a hasty exit. Robert and Joseph are walked to the General Services Administration office, where they're asked to produce identification for the company they worked for, and, you know, it's obvious they're not repairmen, they're just conservative boys. Now, there were two reasons why this plan of James's was somewhat ill-conceived. Firstly, as noted by Andrew Breitbart in the aftermath, the Mary Landrieu phone sting was high risk, low reward. Although the venture was significant to Tea Party activists, to the rest of America, the functionality of Landrieu's phones was an arguably benign point to prove. But the second, more important reason why James should maybe have reconsidered this mission was that entering a federal office under false pretenses was a crime.
Joseph Basil and Stan Dye are waiting for the missing member of their trio still inside, waiting on a taxi to take them away, and waiting to hear if they'll now face time behind bars.
Truth shall set me free.
Well-known conservative activist James O'Keefe was the first to hop on in the Aqua cab. He, the two others, and a fourth man were arrested for allegedly planning and carrying out a plot to enter Mary Landrieu's Senate office.
Well, Chris, these men face 10 years behind bars if they're convicted of these crimes.
This was nothing more than an act that was brazen, that was novice, and that was stupid.
Here's a quick summary of James's night in prison. First of all, James realizes that now he's experienced being arrested, he is a true freedom fighter. James also highlights that he and his friends appear to have been sent to a prison where everyone else is black, and the other people have been sent down for stuff which is far worse than just DUIs or missed child support. I don't know how in the world James could actually know this, but I can imagine that he would have stood out in jail, yes, for sure. And lastly, James has booked a nice skiing holiday which he's keen to go on, and the flight leaves the very next morning, so he signs a document waiving his Miranda rights. He explains, "A nightmare day in windowless cages had shrunk my will to nothing. Plus, I had a plane to catch. I was supposed to go skiing at Tahoe. I just wanted out. Signing the document was my plea for mercy. I had done nothing wrong. I had nothing to hide. If I could talk, I could clear this up and be out on the slopes pronto. The truth would set me free, wouldn't it?" The conclusion of this saga was that James O'Keefe eventually pled guilty to a criminal misdemeanor and was asked to complete 100 hours of community service. There's a tweet on Breitbart's Twitter about this where he reliably comes to James's defense. "Why would I talk about O'Keefe/Landrieu? He pled guilty to exactly what Borat does misdemeanor. Woohoo!" Yeah, he's having a good time. Only in the eyes of Andrew Breitbart could James be a serious citizen journalist, but at the same time also Borat, a make-believe moron from Kazakhstan. James's aim was now to find his next big video, the one that was going to smash the progressives in the same way that his Acorn videos had done in 2009. In June 2010, 5 months after the Landrieu debacle, James released a new recording with the thought-provoking title, Undercover Census Fraud Investigation. In this video, we see James getting a job at the Census Bureau and showing us how, on 2 training days in the office, the staff were supposed to work till 5, but the team leader let them all go early on both days.
My first day of training, we left at 4 p.m. My second day of training, we arrived at work at 9 in the morning, but left shortly after 3:30 p.m. But our timesheets indicated we started work at 8:30 in the morning and left at 5 p.m.
The rest of the video consists of James trying to bring the issue of his incorrect timesheet to people's attention, and in complete defiance of the rules, they all tell him to stop worrying about it and chill out.
I confronted Vincent Fitzpatrick at a nearby Dunkin' Donuts to ask him about the fraudulent timesheets. Vincent didn't seem to have a problem with the discrepancy, so I decided to try to get answers from the regional census headquarters in Montvale, New Jersey.
Just wouldn't worry about it. All right.
I wrote a letter to the top regional supervisor, Ed Finkelstein. I asked him if I would get in trouble for the timesheet discrepancies.
So we'll take your letter and we'll forward it on to the people and to the regional people, and let's see where they take it and what sort of adjustments they make.
The Census Bureau has yet to make the adjustments. I got my paycheck. Your tax money remains in James O'Keefe's checking account.
I couldn't find any articles written about this in the national press, which I'm assuming means that not that many people bothered to report on it. You can see the point James was trying to make here. Government workers are receiving unnecessary pay, but his evidence for this was a couple of hours extra time on a timesheet during a training day. You can kind of see why a lot of papers wouldn't really consider this to be newsworthy.
But this was the training program, and you can see that in the actual census program, they were holding workers to much stricter standards. We have some videotape of that as well.
Set the odometer and everyday recording, don't estimate it, don't guess it. That's part of their ability to audit you, would be to look at your miles. And if they look at the places you went to, that didn't add up, you're great.
It's being pretty clear there.
Yeah, but I mean, he's saying those things, but what does he actually do? I mean, this is a guy who gave us a 70-minute lunch break, and we got paid for, you know, all that time. He let us out at 3:30 p.m.
James is correct that his videos exposed fraud. It was just a pernickety type of fraud that was hard for people to care about. This was the fundamental problem with the video. It was boring. There were no pimps and prostitutes, no comedy moments. And if anything, as a viewer, it was very easy to sympathize with the workers trying to go about their day whilst they were getting bothered by this hall monitor kid.
I confronted Vincent Fitzpatrick at a nearby Dunkin' Donuts to ask him about the fraudulent timesheets.
There was an important lesson in here for James O'Keefe. It wasn't enough for his videos to expose things. He also needed to make content which tapped into people's emotions, finding topics that stirred up anger and disgust in them. This is why his Acorn videos about a sex scandal had done so well, whilst his Census Bureau recordings about timesheets had not. Towards the end of 2010, James gives this another go and does a much better job. He releases a video project revolving around teachers' unions.
Get ready! The following is a paid program for teachers' unions gone wild. What happens when you take the upper echelon of teachers and union leaders in New Jersey and bring them together into one lavish hotel? It can only add up to one thing. One wild and crazy NJEA leadership conference.
The whole thing has this South Park Reb Schneider voice narrating throughout, and the guy who James O'Keefe has sent in to film people undercover has this super distinctive laugh. In this video, you see clips of teachers saying they get a lot of free shit. You see teachers saying that it's hard to fire tenured members of staff.
Really hard to fire a tenured teacher. Really hard. Like, you seriously have to be in the hallway fucking somebody.
You see teachers joking that they can become principals and then mess with the kids.
I can be a principal. I can really fuck with kids.
And quite a few clips where the teachers chat shit about Republican Governor Chris Christie. At first, the teachers' union might seem like an odd target for James O'Keefe, but when you look at the news stories from around that time, you realise why this video came into being. It was the recession, times were tough, and Republican Governor Chris Christie was making serious budget cuts in the state of New Jersey that had a big impact on teachers. Unions were up in arms about this, and there were protest marches from both teachers and students at schools. Chris Christie, not one to back down from a fight, punched back at the teachers' unions, characterizing them as power-hungry bullies using taxpayer money to get what they wanted.
But the teachers' union is about the accumulation and exercise of raw power. Who is going to run public education in New Jersey? The parents and the people they elect, or the mindless, faceless union leaders who decide that they're going to be the ones who are going to run it? I know I don't make myself the most popular guy in the world by having this fight, but we don't win this fight, there's no other fights left. This is the fight we got to fight. This is the fight we have to win for our kids.
Somewhere not too far away in New Jersey, James O'Keefe was watching this, listening to Chris Christie, and picking his Project Veritas cap back up off the nightstand.
You son of a bitch! I'm in!
The event which Project Veritas secretly filmed for this video was a teachers' union conference. From the recording, you can see that there was a training element to this in the daytime, where people are gathered in a meeting room, but most of the footage which James uses in his recording comes from the evening, when all the teachers are drunk as hell. The moment of the recording which is the most incendiary is this bit where a teacher says the N-word.
We had a teacher that just recently was like, you He's been moved down to who? Another student. To a student, and the teacher, has been demoted, but is still teaching.
Now, to me, from the tone of this woman's voice, it seemed obvious that she was telling this story incredulously, surprised that her massively racist colleague is still in the job and didn't suffer worse consequences than being demoted. But this is how her comments are characterized in James's video.
They'll even brag about their members not getting fired for calling black kids the N-word.
Now, it turned out that the person in James's video, Elisa Ploshnik, had spent $9,000 of her own money on school supplies for the kids she taught over the course of her career. And randomly, in 1997, she jumped in front of a runaway van to save a group of students from being mowed down, landing herself in hospital with broken ribs. She received a letter from the president at the time commending her for doing that. After 14 years of teaching, Ploshnik was suspended from work and had her pay docked for the comments she made on tape. Superintendent Robert Holster said he was aware that the use of the N-word only happened in the context of Ploshnik reporting the speech of another member of staff, but he said that the school is multicultural and everyone has to be extremely sensitive in their thinking if they're on our payroll. He also quite aptly said, "Politically correct is the theme of the day." James O'Keefe was expertly pioneering his own brand of conservative cancel culture, and this teachers union video was perfectly conceived. It had humour, it had people getting drunk, it had the N-word. Through releasing this, James was able to give Governor Chris Christie a useful tool in his fight against the teachers unions.
Join me now and slander Chris Christie. Here is Christie in response. Listen.
Not surprised by what I saw the teachers union doing and saying.
And today the teachers union said they would love to talk to you. They're ready to talk to you and that you won't.
I think they did in the video, don't you?
In his book, James expresses jubilation at managing to impress Governor Chris Christie, converting him into a powerful ally. If the teachers union video had been the only coverage James received at the end of 2010, then it would have been, all things considered, a pretty good conclusion to the year for Project Veritas. However, at around that time, James was appearing in the news for an entirely different reason.
Medical bands in the kitchen. Medical bands for the whipping. Take a nigga bitch go missing. Ooh, bitch I ball like a blister.
In the fall of 2010, CNN's Abby Boudreau was producing a documentary about rising stars in the new Tea Party movement. The documentary featured Hannah Giles, who of course had done the Acorn sting with James, along with James's mentor Andrew Breitbart, and James was asked whether he wanted to be involved. Now, at the time, James was upset with CNN because of the way they'd covered the story of his arrest at the start of the year. He felt that his foray into Mary Landrieu's office had been mischaracterized as something far more insidious than it actually was, given that he was just trying to video record conversations there. He agreed to speak to CNN's reporter and they set up a time and location for the interview.
I can meet for those days. I'm down in it's near Solomon's is the name of the town. It's in Maryland.
That would be good.
You know, I just feel more comfortable if it was just me and you, and we just had a face-to-face meeting.
The place where James wanted to meet was Solomon's Island. Boat fans in my audience who watched the last video will remember that this is where James kept his vessel, a Catalina 27. Now, although James had agreed to the interview, in true Project Veritas style, behind the scenes, he was secretly concocting a classic prank that would embarrass the CNN hacks once and for all and show them that he was not someone to be messed with. So, on a sunny day in September, CNN's Abby Boudreau turns up to the agreed location to meet James, and she is greeted by one of James's female associates, Izzy Santa, who looks very uncomfortable. Abby asks Izzy what's wrong, and Izzy says that James is planning to prank Abby and record the results, but the details of what he's got in store make Izzy feel profoundly uncomfortable, and she tells Abby that she shouldn't get on the boat. After some time has passed, James emerges, and in a brief conversation, Abby tells him that since he had never mentioned wanting to tape their meeting, the interview is cancelled, and she leaves. So, what prank was James planning? Unfortunately, we will never know. Is what I'd be saying if Izzy had not forwarded CNN internal emails exchanged between James and his associates at Project Veritas, which broke down the prank in meticulous detail.
Well, the full plan is a 13-page document called the CNN Caper document, and it's divided into two parts. The first part is how to punk CNN, how to trick CNN into reporting a false story, either about Sarah Palin or the Tea Party movement, and then giving Fox News a heads up of what we were about to report as a false story so that they could quote unquote pounce and undercut CNN's credibility. That's the first part. The second part is about how to punk me specifically.
That was Abby Boudreau speaking there, the would-be prankee, summarising the first part of the document which Project Veritas prepared for this elaborate operation. We will now go through the second bit, which is the actual prank itself. Okay, so first of all we get this introduction page which has a picture of Abby and then lists the equipment and props which are going to be needed for this classic prank. Hidden cams on the boat, tripod, an overt recorder near the bed, an obvious sex tape machine, a condom jar, dildos, music such as Alicia Keys, 80s romance songs, things that are typically James, avoid Marvin Gaye as too cliche, lube, ceiling mirror, posters and paintings of naked women, Playboys and pornographic magazines, candles, Viagra and stamina pills, fuzzy handcuffs, a blindfold. So, those are the ingredients that are going to come together to make a really good prank. And for what the prank is actually going to be, we can turn to the monologue which has been written here for James to read out at the start of the prank video.
My name is James O'Keefe. I work in video activism and journalism. I've been approached by CNN for an interview where I know what their angle is. They want to portray me and my friends as crazies, as non-journalists, as unprofessional and likely as homophobes, racists, or bigots of some sort. Abby, who works for Anderson Cooper at CNN, a network notorious for journalistic malpractice, wants to lull me into thinking she's my friend, so she can use me and hurt my career. Instead, I've decided to have a little fun. Instead of giving her a serious interview, I'm going to punk CNN. Abby has been trying to seduce me, to use me, in order to spin a lie about me. So I'm going to seduce her, on camera, to use her for a video. This bubble-headed bleach blonde who comes on at 5 will get a taste of her own medicine. She'll get seduced on camera, and you'll get to see the awkwardness and the aftermath. Please sit back and enjoy the show.
So James's plan, if you can call it a plan, was to get Abby Boudreau onto a boat filled with sex toys and then hit on her. It's a classic prank. Obviously, as ideas go, this one was pretty silly. But there is something really interesting about this document in that it shows the level of detail Project Veritas goes into when planning their camera stings. For example, there are notes for what the undercover journalist's persona should be. James should have a more sleazy persona than normal. That is unfortunately phrased. It should be entirely over the top. The persona should be very touchy-feely, ideally wearing gold chain and with cigarettes. There's also a meticulous plan here about what tactics should be used in order to make sure James gets the clips he needs. As the operation is going on, James will have to adapt and adjust to her mood and her reaction. If she's pulling away, withdraw and pull her back in. If she's unsure, comfort her and reassure her. Vacillate between somewhat serious interview and the come hither persona as needed in order to confuse her judgment and also keep her on the boat. She wants to do the interview. She spent thousands of dollars to do this interview. She is invested. Our job is to make sure she doesn't run away or break too soon. You want to make sure you have plenty of video and pre-reveal moments before the reveal and not to proverbially shoot your load before the catalytic moment, the big reveal for her. So keep her hooked and use hot, cold and push-pull kind of psychological tactics in order to keep her in the skit. The Project Veritas guys have even wrote out some jokes to use during the encounter, things that James will make sure he says at some point to make the footage more entertaining. Starts off with a 10 out of 10.
Abby, this is the Pleasure Palace, and I want to show you the inner sanctum.
And then the effort kind of immediately falls off here.
I want to take you to a higher place. CNN must be a tough place to work. Let's make some headline love.
And then this last one.
It's not news, it's CNN.
By this point, it sounds like he's just letting off some steam. Additionally, there's a part of the document where James predicts how the dialogue of the encounter will go and plans out how he will respond to things. So if Abby says, "Are you recording this?" James will say, "If you want, I can record it. I don't usually record it unless I'm trying out a new position or something really kinky though. I have the camera set up so we can do whatever you want, whatever you feel comfortable with." If Abby says, "Is this a gag?" James will respond, "Abby, I'm not really into S&M, so I don't have any toys like that." If Abby says, "You can't be serious, I'm married," James will respond, "Abby, there's never going to be a right time for you and I. There's only right now. We have to make the most of the time we're given and we're being given right now." It goes without saying that this fiasco won James some media coverage, but not the kind he wanted.
Have you ever thought about if you did get on that boat, what you would have done?
I would have had to have agreed to have been taped.
Okay.
And I was not comfortable with that.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that whole thing is fishy.
What girls would those efforts ever work on? Clearly, O'Keefe here has never actually seduced a woman.
Even a lot of people in the conservative movement who'd previously supported James were a little bit grossed out by him, with his own mentor Andrew Breitbart saying in Politico that the prank was gross and offensive, and going on to add, in this instance, it's not going to be others who are going to defend him. He is an adult and he now has to defend himself. James owes an explanation that helps to put into a greater framework what he does and why he would target a news network and a reporter. I think this strange episode was revealing in a few ways. First of all, it showed that James O'Keefe, at that time, had quite a miscalibrated perception of his own strengths and weaknesses as a media creator. The CNN boat prank seems absurd, yes, but you can tell what James was going for. Punk'd was a really big show in the 2000s, and the pranks on that show went really far. You know, societal taboos were broken as part of the bit, and making celebrities feel uncomfortable was what made the show entertaining. Eric Andre's show on Adult Swim is pretty similar in the way it pushes people to their limits with escalating levels of absurdism. But in a way which is quite subtle, these shows are underpinned by safeguards, whether it's in the implementation of the gags or the persona of the show host, which ensure that the end product winds up being zany rather than sociopathic. Take Punk'd for example. The gags are fucking mean, right? But the producers offset this by getting the celebrities' friends to be in on the joke, and having a clearly delineated moment of catharsis at the end of every prank, where Ashton Kutcher shows up and the celebrity realizes that the torment they've been going through was actually objectively funny the whole time, and they can laugh along with everyone else. The Eric Andre show, by contrast, is safeguarded by the sheer force of the persona that Eric Andre projects. He never breaks character, and shifts gears so rapidly during interviews that the audience ends up having far more in common with the interview subject, bewilderedly wondering what's going to happen next, than Eric Andre himself, who is just our hilarious performing clown. I can't express how differently this show would come across to viewers if Eric was to deliver monologues at the start talking about how he had summoned his media enemies for interviews and was going to use the format of the show to humiliate them and get revenge. We would have a very different perception of Eric Andre's comedy if this was the case. Similarly, if you were to take a Punk'd scenario and isolate the celebrity from their friends and take away the big reveal with Ashton Kutcher, then you essentially get James's CNN prank, which is just luring a woman into a pornography den and hitting on her. And, you know, instead of Ashton Kutcher jumping out, it's just more James O'Keefe hitting on you until you run away. And then James will be like, haha, the prank was that I was hitting on her. James was often touted by Andrew Breitbart as this masterful and edgy comedic showman, frequently compared to Sacha Baron Cohen. And perhaps James believed this himself. In audiences of Tea Party conservative Christians, it might be easier to cultivate this sort of status for yourself. But James O'Keefe is not really Sacha Baron Cohen. He's Dwight Schrute.
We arrived at work at 9 in the morning, but left shortly after 3:30 p.m.
Last time I checked, the American workday ends at 5 p.m.
The primary appeal of James O'Keefe's output had never been entertainment. Sure, he wore funny outfits sometimes, but people weren't watching James's videos for comedy. It was for validation of right-wing fiscal and political concerns. With all the negative attention that James O'Keefe received for the CNN boat caper, 2010 came to a very bitter end. All of this was very upsetting for James, and the aftermath of the sex boat incident forms the basis for the saddest passage in James's book, Breakthrough. On the darkest day of my life to that point, I found myself in a pew at St. Gabriel the Archangel Church in Saddle River, New Jersey. To get there, I drove a car that didn't even have a starter in it. I had to park on hills and pop the clutch to get it running. That's how wrong it had all gone. 26 years old, living at home, stuck in Jersey, mired in debt, abandoned by my allies, estranged from my friends, unable to sleep, unwilling to eat, my career in tatters, crushed by the weight of it all, and praying not for a miracle but just some relief. Felon, terrorist, white supremacist, racist, pervert. Was this really worth it? If you work for a big news organization, you have all kinds of support systems to see you through even a major screw up, and at the end of the week you get a paycheck. I had none of that. My successes had made me more enemies than friends, and recent events had cost me my friends. Not all of them, but many. Beyond my sister and my parents, I was not sure that there was anyone I could count on. But then, there comes an inspirational moment where James pulls out a book called I Believed by Douglas Hyde, a man of goodwill who leaves the Communist Party to become a Catholic. James reflects on the fact that, just like he is doing in this present moment, Douglas once sat on a church pew and witnessed how the power of prayer lifted the weight of the world off people's shoulders. James exclaims, "I knew that I too had to surrender to God. If I did so, I could withstand the powerful forces aligned, fairly or not, against the citizen journalist. In my possession I had a series of tapes showcasing corruption at the New Jersey Education Association, a teachers' union.
Teachers' unions gone wild.
I asked myself whether I could justify taking the risks anymore, whether I could endure the lies of my enemies and the defamation of the machine, but I knew that as long as I had my family and my faith in God, I was going to be okay. I immediately felt renewed. It was out of my hands now. And then he released a pop song.
What you come to know. Now we need a bit of action that will give this the traction. As a matter of fact.
This is my favourite piece of media James O'Keefe has ever produced. I love the dancing, I love the costumes, I love the bass from the Seinfeld theme. James made this music video essentially so that he could call out his haters, but in a really cool way. So we have bars like, trying to call us racist, making up shit that's baseless. And as he sings, he shows the faces of the people who I reckon have called him a racist. The main star of the video, apart from James, of course, is an actress who plays Mary Landrieu. In the opening bars of the tune, she villainously asks her staffers to destroy James's videotape because it proves that he's totally innocent and a nice guy.
We'll put them in jail.
There's no evidence they were here to commit a felony.
Find some evidence. Call the cell phone and listening device if you have to.
And what about the videotape? It corroborates what they're claiming.
Destroy it.
I didn't actually edit that freeze frame in. That's part of the tune to draw attention to the sick bass solo. Other highlights include the bit where the beat is so good that the FBI officers start dancing with James. And also the bit where James randomly turns around from a blackboard and he's like, a chic. Doesn't relate to any lyrics in the song. Anyway, it's a 10 from me. In 2011, James O'Keefe set his sights on the biggest non-profit radio organization in America, NPR. Like with any classic Project Veritas mission, there is a backstory to this one rooted in conservative media outrage which prompted James to take action. And this particular backstory revolved around a news reporter called Juan Williams. Juan had been working for NPR since the year 2000. However, throughout his time at the organization, he was also appearing regularly on Fox News, often brought on as a liberal counterweight to the conservative opinions of the company's leading anchors. There was a big conflict of interest all the way through this, because NPR and Fox News had fundamentally different ethoses and principles. As a recipient of federal funding, NPR was obligated to report the news in a dry and detached manner, imposing a code of ethics which all of its journalists had to follow. Fox News, by contrast, is infotainment, delivering fiery TV debates driven by colourful characters and divisive opinions. In the case of Juan Williams, you can see that he took up two entirely separate personas, one when he was working for NPR, and an entirely different one when he was on Fox News.
Now the question is whether there will be a new round of attention to poverty. A Census Bureau report showed an increase of 17% in Americans living in poverty since President Bush has been in office.
Your suggestion that Joe Wilson was having menopause, that he had a heat flash and jumped up. How come you said he had this emotional outburst? He couldn't control it. He was emotional.
In essence, whilst the NPR Code of Ethics demanded a neutral, clear voice from Juan, Fox News were paying him to be the exact opposite. This dichotomy came to a head in October 2010 when Juan made a comment about Muslims while appearing on The O'Reilly Factor.
I mean, look, Bill, I'm not a bigot. You know the kind of books I've written about the civil rights movement in this country. But when I get on a plane, I got to tell you, if I see people who are in Muslim garb and I think, they're identifying themselves first and foremost as Muslims, I get worried. I get nervous.
I want to frame this event with as much context as possible, so it's important to note that Juan Williams' comments here occurred in an exchange where he was actually pushing back on Bill O'Reilly's far more stigmatizing language towards Muslims.
Well, you can't really say the Muslims attack us on 9/11.
No, but what Barbara Walters said to you...
Norwegians?
Wait, hold on. Because if you said, Timothy McVeigh, the Atlanta bomber, these people who are protesting against homosexuality at military funerals, very obnoxious, you don't say first and foremost, we got a problem with Christians.
Because
that'd be crazy.
But who is causing the problem in Germany? Is it the Muslims who have come there or the Germans?
Absolutely.
Who's causing the problem?
I think, no, wait. You see, you did it again. It's extremists. It's people who refuse to assimilate into German society.
However, Juan's comments about being nervous around Muslims on planes still drew a lot of media attention and complaints from segments of NPR's audience. In particular from a Muslim organization called the Council on American Islamic Relations. In the midst of the backlash, NPR took the decision to fire Juan Williams, issuing a statement which said, "His remarks on the O'Reilly factor this past Monday were inconsistent with our editorial standards and practices and undermined his credibility as a news analyst with NPR." This kicked off exactly the reaction you'd expect from American conservatives.
High-profile members of the right have come to Williams' defense. Newt Gingrich accused NPR of censorship.
I think that the U.S. Congress should investigate NPR and I should consider cutting off their money.
While Sarah Palin tweeted, "Lights shine on left's lamestream media lies and hypocrisy."
The assault on NPR went all the way up to the House Republican leader, John Boehner, who told National Review Online that, "I think it's reasonable to ask why Congress is spending taxpayers' money to support a left-wing radio network, and in the wake of Juan Williams' firing, it's clearer than ever that's what NPR is." This whole debate had the effect of shining a massive Project Veritas bat signal straight over James O'Keefe's house, calling him to action, and 6 months later, he emerged with a new Project Veritas sting operation.
On February 22, 2011, two citizen journalists posed as Muslims and visited with two of the top senior executives at NPR. On the MIAC website, it said the organization sought to, quote, spread the acceptance of Sharia across the world. The reporters posing as Muslims explained they were interested in making a $5 million donation to publicly run media.
The current Republican Party is not really the Republican Party. It's been hijacked by this group that is...
radical, racist, Islamophobic, Tea Party people.
And not just Islamophobic, but really xenophobic. I mean, basically, they believe in sort of white, middle America, gun-toting, they're seriously based.
James's video immediately achieved the desired effect. Ron Schiller resigned as soon as the video came out, and the day after there was a resignation from the NPR CEO Vivian Schiller. Needless to say, the video gave more fuel to the argument of House Republicans that NPR should have its funding cut. Representative Eric Cantor of Virginia, the Republican majority leader, said in a statement, "This disturbing video makes clear that taxpayer dollars should no longer be appropriated to NPR." This was a much needed win for James O'Keefe that came at exactly the right time. After all the embarrassments he'd faced during the previous year, he'd managed to produce another sting, just like the Acorn one, which had it all. Resignations, headlines, but most importantly of all, validation of his worth to Andrew Breitbart and to mainstream conservatives as an undercover citizen journalist. The NPR tapes got an enormous response from the media. Before we take a closer look at the full unedited version, I think it's useful to document a rough timeline of events which shows how things unfolded after their release. The video is first published by the Daily Caller on March the 8th. It immediately reverberates around the blogosphere, with both right-wing blogs like MRC and left-wing blogs like Slate picking up on it, and later in the day it also receives headlines from ABC News, New York Times, as well as NPR itself. In the midst of this, Ron Schiller resigns. The next day is the big one, where all the major outlets pick up on the story, and as the CEO of NPR resigns, it becomes even bigger as a news item. In the aftermath of James O'Keefe's new media splash, here's what he had to say.
I think journalists have been doing this for a long time. I think it's a form of investigative reporting that you use to seek and find the truth. The tape is very powerful. The tape is very honest. The tape cuts to the core of who these people are.
It isn't until March the 10th, after the resignations have happened and the theories of NPR's bias towards Islam are running wild in the public sphere, that an article is published that questions whether what was shown in James's edited NPR video was actually an accurate representation of events. And of all people, it was Glenn Beck's conservative media outlet, The Blaze, who published this article. Here's what they write. When undercover video like the NPR story first surfaces, we often look to see if there is raw video of the material used to produce the report as a basis for evaluating the accuracy of the representations made, and we decided to do that in this case. These are sometimes difficult matters to consider, especially for those who are pleased with the outcomes produced by the release of video reports like this. However, the ethical implications can be significant. As we say around the Blaze water cooler, the truth has no agenda. Perspective and context are essential elements in bringing truth to the forefront. To exclude or alter them can obscure truths rather than reveal them. Now, the first thing that surprised me whilst reading this article was that a full unedited version of the NPR tapes had been released by James. On the same day that the Daily Caller had published their 10-minute editorial on NPR, James O'Keefe had uploaded the full unedited version of the recording to his site. At the moment, the unedited video is still up on Vimeo, currently sitting at 24,000 views, whilst the edited one, uploaded to the main Project Veritas YouTube account, is at 1 million views, meaning that 0.02% of people bothered to have a look at what happened in its full context. Now, before The Blaze published their article, all of the mainstream media outlets who'd reported on this largely accepted the premises put forward by James's Project Veritas video, albeit whilst also taking pains to point out his controversial past media stunts and misadventures. The article that The Blaze published on March the 10th was the first one which actually questioned what we'd been shown in the edited video, the way in which it had seemingly been put together to leave the viewer with a specific impression, which wasn't necessarily representative of the full discussion which had actually taken place. I used a particular phrasing there which I know that James O'Keefe has a profound problem with. I said that his video had premises, or in other words that his video made claims. James has expressed in the past that he considers this to be a particularly ill-founded line of attack against him, given that his videos don't make any claims. They just show you things that people have said.
Twitter disputes the claim from O'Keefe's video today. Well, it wasn't my claim. I didn't create the quote, but O'Keefe claims.
James is right to point out that he doesn't invent quotes in his own head or somehow remotely control the mouths of the people featured in his videos. In Project Veritas videos, we see real people using their own words, and James is just showing that to you, so how can he be accused of making any claims? Let's use the NPR video as a case study for this. The final cut which James edited together is split into sections which include, but are not limited to, subjects such as spreading Sharia law, Republicans and the Tea Party, and institutional bias towards Muslims and Palestine. Each section of James's edited video features a few quotes, sometimes from Ron, sometimes from James O'Keefe's own undercover reporters, which have been brought together for the final cut. As a viewer, you're not likely to watch these sections and merely come away thinking, wow, I now know that Ron said A, said B, and said C. No. Your brain is going to reify the clips you've seen into larger assumptions about Ron and the views he holds, and by proxy the views of NPR, as Ron is there to represent them. Let's build a little hypothetical example. If you saw clips of Ron saying, "Can we talk about the new Whole Foods advert for a second? I love organic produce so much, and the staff are actually so welcoming and friendly," it would be natural to assume as a viewer that Ron shops at Whole Foods and likes it there. Now, James O'Keefe might say that as a journalist, he is not making any claims that Ron shops at Whole Foods. That's actually for us, the viewers, to decide. James is just showing us these 3 quotes that Ron has said. But here's the thing. Arriving at this conclusion is an inevitability given the way these quotes have been presented to us. And of course, it's a purposeful choice on the part of the video maker to do this. Whilst James cannot physically invent the clips he uses, he can facilitate a journey for the viewer towards a specific conclusion by virtue of his editing, and in doing so, he plays a role in the formulation of claims which don't come from the raw quotes themselves, but rather from their implications as a unified whole. Therefore, I think it's fair to say that James's videos do put forward claims. This brings me on to another line of criticism which James has taken umbrage to in the past. It relates to his editing. In his book Breakthrough, James responds to a journalist saying that his short NPR video took things out of context by saying, the journalist was sophisticated enough to know that when you whittle 2 hours down to 11 minutes, more will be cut than kept. It's absolutely true that in any final cut, a video maker will have to make decisions about what they're going to leave out and what they're going to include. And it's inherently a process of trimming down, of getting rid of things that aren't essential, because it's stupid to spend an hour relaying a point to your viewers that you could easily demonstrate to them in 30 seconds. However, a problem emerges, specifically in the medium that James uses, which aims to expose the unfiltered truth. If the conclusions that you lead your viewers to by way of the clips you purposefully include in your final cut are not supported by what's actually in the raw footage. Returning to our hypothetical example, maybe the full conversation that Ron had does indeed show that he shops at Whole Foods. But on the other hand, what if you were to watch the full conversation and his actual quote was this? "Can we talk about the new Whole Foods advert for a second? It's a piece of shit. I hate that place with a passion. I love organic produce so much, but Whole Foods sucks ass and I would never buy anything from there. I always go to my local grocers instead because the staff are actually so welcoming and friendly, unlike the Whole Foods staff." If this was the full quote, then criticism would be more than justified because the video maker purposefully isolated excerpts from here to distort its meaning and led the viewer to a completely false conclusion. So, with it now firmly established that James O'Keefe can make claims through his editing, and that editing can potentially be misused to create a false narrative, let's analyze the Project Veritas NPR video. Here's how the Project Veritas video begins.
On the MIAC website, it said the organization sought to, quote, spread the acceptance of Sharia across the world.
Really? That's what they said?
James talks about the MEAC's mission to spread Sharia law, and then we cut to this shot of Ron Schiller laughing about it. One might naturally assume from watching this that Ron Schiller was somewhat amused and unfazed about the donor trying to spread Sharia law around America. But if you watch the unedited conversation, Ron's laughter here is taken from an entirely separate part of the conversation. Here's the full context of what he was laughing about.
Nice to meet you. Amin. Nice to meet you.
They initially directed us to a big room where I guess there's a party also under the name Ibrahim.
Really? That's what they said?
They actually tried to direct us there too.
So, the juxtaposition is odd here, interspersing Ron's unrelated laughter at being directed to the wrong room with heavy references to Sharia law as if that is what he's reacting to. Erstwhile editor-in-chief at The Blaze, Scott Baker, described this moment as a warning flag.
That to us was a signal that they were trying to condition the person watching the piece to feel as though there was assent to these ideas. That was a big warning flag.
The edited video does an awful lot to emphasize the Muslimness of the undercover reporters, with music, with James's narration, then the reference to Sharia law, and the video shows us this exchange with the NPR guys.
So, you asked about our organization, and we contribute to a number of Muslim schools, Orthodox Muslim schools across the U.S., and more recently we contributed to some universities. And, so our organization was originally founded by a few members of the Muslim Brotherhood in America, actually.
The logical inference the viewer might make from this sequence is that the NPR execs have been made fully aware of their donors' Sharia law-spreading crusade. However, in the unedited video, when the NPR guys ask them for more details about their organization, they're not nearly as forthcoming as James's edited video would lead you to believe.
Can you tell us something about the history of the organization? Do you know more about it?
Well, I mean, there's not too much note, except that, it started as kind of like a local organization, and then they established the trust to kind of support it and to, as a walk to, for a lot of local schools in the New Jersey and New York area.
And how long ago?
Well, the trust was in 1988. I believe the original center was 1986. Late 90s, it was and so we have set aside, I believe, something like $5 million.
When asked, James's undercover reporter says there's not really much to tell about their organization, and immediately steers the conversation back to the $5 million they want to invest in NPR. At no point in the discussion do they ever mention Sharia law. The people who are most explicitly made aware of this mission to spread Sharia law in America is the audience, because it's so vividly highlighted to us at the start of the video, tucked into the end of a blurb on a website the NPR execs may never have read. It's an interesting sleight of hand where the nefarious dealings of the MEAC are shouted to the audience, but whispered or even withheld in conversation with the NPR officials. The video largely portrays Ron Schiller and Betsy Liley as NPR yes men desperate for approval, willing to shape their editorial bias in line with what the Muslim donors want to hear. The way this happens is through clips which suggest a bias towards Palestine, and James's undercover reporters overtly saying they want to use their money to influence NPR's media coverage, without any apparent opposition from the NPR executives.
The reporters posing as Muslims explained they were interested in making a $5 million donation to publicly run media.
The Palestinian viewpoint, since NPR is one of the few places that has the courage to really present it, that there's kind of a joke that we used to call it National Palestinian Radio.
And frankly, many organizations, I'm sure there are Muslim organizations that are not looking for a fair point of view, right? They're looking for a very particular point of view. And that's fine. We're not one of them. Right. I'm gathering that you're not, actually.
So let's go through these 3 clips. Firstly, we have James O'Keefe narrating that the Muslim funders want to give a $5 million donation to publicly run media. Then we have the reporter making his National Palestinian Radio joke with Ron laughing. And finally, we have the undercover reporter saying his Muslim organization is not looking for a fair point of view, and Ron going, "Lol, I'm getting that impression." The sequence is pretty indicative of NPR being happy to bend their news agenda to the viewpoints of their extremist donors. But let's look at the full context of what happened after James O'Keefe's undercover reporter told that Palestinian joke.
National Palestinian Radio. I mean, in a good way. So,
well, and that is the commitment. And I'm very proud of the fact that there are the journalists who are involved with NPR. Most of them have been involved for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. They are deeply committed and unwavering, and there's nothing that can be done. We work on this all the time because we have funders approach us from lots of different points of view, and there's such a big firewall between funding and reporting, and reporters will not be swayed in any way, shape, or form. What we try to do is to find funders who share our values and to be able to support them in doing the kind of work that they're doing, which is, again, this fair and balanced voice of reason.
Ron states unequivocally that there is a big firewall between donors and reporters, and that NPR will not be swayed by their donors to do anything other than objective journalistic reporting. However, then, there commences this deluge of effort from James O'Keefe's undercover reporters to try and get Ron to revise this opinion for them.
As a black Muslim, I am truly and highly offended by the racism and the bigotry and the Islamophobia that is coming out of the Tea Party or Tea Baggers or whatever you call them. What is NPR doing, and what can we do to help make sure that this kind of situation can be curtailed and stopped?
Well, I think NPR's point of view always is to be independent voice of reason and to report news fairly and so on.
And so our question to you is largely, how can we help fight back against Fox News and against, especially since you're on the radio, what passes for conservatism?
The Rush Limbaughs and the honey I mentioned. All of
radio is much worse than on TV.
Yeah.
Well, I think first and foremost, the vote of confidence in NPR is really the most important thing that can be done. Just to say, we as an organization value fair and balanced coverage. What NPR won't do and can't do is say, okay, we're going to run this many stories that are pro this or pro that, that news directors won't do. Right, but we were not going to do that. Similar to any organizations trying to direct the news, we can't do that.
Again and again and again, James O'Keefe's undercover reporters try to get a soundbite from Ron implying that they can buy favourable coverage from NPR, and Ron consistently replies that NPR's duty is just to fairly and accurately report the news. The clip that James chooses to show in his edited video, where his undercover reporters say they're not looking for a fair point of view, and Ron says, "Yes, I'm getting that impression," it comes at the point in the full conversation where Ron has rebuffed James' reporters 6 times for saying stupid things like, what is NPR going to do about the racist Tea Party? How is NPR going to fight Fox News? And we would like to see more Palestinian coverage. Out of all the footage James has captured of Ron denying these requests, The part James chooses to place in his edited video, somewhat remarkably, suggests rather the opposite of everything that has taken place to be true, suggesting to the viewer that there is a complicit willingness at NPR to indulge a donor's request to corruptly influence a news agenda, when in actual fact, these are words which have been spoken begrudgingly to a pair of unrelenting ideologues who do not seem to have been able to get the simple message of NPR's non-partisan reporting into their heads. There is a calculated logic to the process James has gone through to create this section. He shows his own undercover reporter telling a scripted national Palestinian radio joke, and then moves into this clip, specifically because he has been woefully unsuccessful in obtaining any sound bites from Ron which prove his thesis about NPR's agenda-driven coverage to be true. Rather than abandoning his theory, which has been disproven by his own investigation, James edits together incomplete snapshots of the conversation which took place, to heavily imply his theory still to be the case, in flagrant contradiction with the 6 pieces of evidence he has confirming the exact opposite to be true. Al Tompkins, a journalist from the publication Pointer, flagged this up as one of the most deceptive things about the way James O'Keefe had edited together his final cut.
The message that he said most often, I counted 6 times, he told these 2 people that he had never met before that you cannot buy coverage. He says it over and over and over again.
Finally, let's discuss what I believe to be the most eyebrow-raising aspect of James O'Keefe's video, which revolves around Ron Schiller's comments pertaining to the Republican Party.
The current Republican Party, particularly the Tea Party, is fanatically involved in people's personal lives and very fundamental Christian, and I wouldn't even call it Christian, it's this weird evangelical kind of move. The current Republican Party is not really the Republican Party, but it's been hijacked by this group that is
the radical, racist, Islamophobic, tea party people.
And not just Islamophobic, but really xenophobic. I mean, basically they believe that sort of white, middle America, gun-toting, I mean, it's pretty scary. They're seriously based.
These quotes, played one after the other in the edited video, have been stitched together from several different parts of the longer conversation. I'm going to show you where they came from, and the full context surrounding them. Let's start with the quote where Ron talks about the Republican Party being fanatically involved in people's lives.
Right now there is, I'll talk personally as opposed to wearing my NPR hat. It feels to me as though there's a real anti-intellectual move on the part of a significant part of the Republican Party. It's not all Republicans. In fact, I grew up a Republican and am proud of that, even though I've voted mostly Democratic lately. I like the Republican Party in terms of fiscal conservatism, but where and the fact that the Republican Party of old really believed that government has no role in personal lives and family lives, and that government is really about other things. The current Republican Party, the particular Tea Party, is fanatically involved in people's personal lives and very fundamental Christian, and I wouldn't even call it Christian, it's this weird evangelical.
Ron makes the distinction that he's not speaking about all Republicans, and he actually speaks very positively about conservatism in general. However, the only part that James O'Keefe includes in his edited video is this end bit, where Ron talks about the faction of the Republican Party he doesn't agree with. Now let's go on to the second quote, which includes Ron's remarks about the Republican Party being xenophobic. When watching the full video, you actually find that Ron is not expressing his own opinions, but rather those of his friends, who are themselves Republicans.
I won't break a confidence, but a person who was an ambassador, so a very highly placed Republican, another person who was one of the top donors to the Republican Party, they both told me they voted for Obama, which they never believed they could ever do in their lives, that they could ever vote for a Democrat, ever. And they did because they believe that the current Republican Party is not really the Republican Party, that it's been hijacked by this group that is... I mean, basically they believe that they're white, middle America gun-toting, and it's pretty scary. They're seriously based.
So here, Ron is reporting the speech of 2 Republican donors he knows, people who are literally part of the Republican Party. It is they, not him, who believe that the party has been hijacked by people who are xenophobic. What James O'Keefe does here is to cut Ron's quote so that it starts from this bit, removing the words "they believe that" so it's not possible for his viewers to see that Ron is reporting someone else's opinions. In his book, James writes that he believes Ron was merely inventing Republicans as a rhetorical device, saying the Republicans' opinions were clearly his own, and he expounded on them with relish. My question to James would be, if this is so clear in the full context of the conversation, then why not leave the context in and allow your audience to come to the same level-headed conclusion for themselves? It takes a conscious decision to take a quote like this, chop it off mid-sentence, and then recaption it in your new video with a capital letter at the start so that no one can tell that this is chopped up from a bigger quote. Why make this editing decision that deprives your audience of contextual information when you could just show them the full quote? From what James has written in his book, this appears to stem from James taking a specific editorial stance based on his reading of the situation, and then modifying the way he presents information to his audience to ensure that no other reading is possible. Recently, James tweeted that he agrees with the notion that media consumers need to be treated like adults. I agree with this sentiment. I think it's sometimes worth reminding ourselves that actions speak louder than words. If you proudly endorse this statement, but then when it comes to your own media creations you're deliberately suppressing information to bottle feed your audience a simplified narrative, you risk being accused of hypocrisy. What's even more interesting is that this actually fits a broader pattern of James featuring video clips in his final cut, but removing parts of them which mention Republicans. Here's another clip from his final video edit, which pertains to the firing of Juan Williams.
And even around the Juan Williams issue, we had a really great discussion with them, and they all agreed in the end, well, of course you have to fire him. But why they won't
He
say...
worked for Fox News.
Why they won't say that...
That's good enough reason, isn't it?
In the video, it's natural for the viewer to assume that Ron Schiller is talking about executives at NPR discussing Juan Williams. However, in fact, Ron Schiller is not talking about NPR executives. Again, he's talking about Republicans.
We actually had a very amusing dinner. I asked one of my very conservative friends who lives in Washington if they would give a dinner of very conservative people in government. And there were 10 of them that came to a dinner that they gave in their home with Vivian and with me. And the purpose of the dinner was to ask them if they really believed that NPR had a liberal bias or not. By the time we finished the dinner, every single person around the room admitted that they listened to it every day because it's the only place they can get intelligent recording. And even around the Juan Williams issue, we had a really great discussion with them, and they all agreed in the end, well, of course you have to fire him. But why they won't
He
say...
worked for Fox News.
Why they won't say that...
That's good enough reason, isn't it?
Although James features this clip in his final cut, he removes the parts which would make it clear to the viewer that Ron is talking about a focus group of conservative people in government. It's even more eyebrow-raising given what it reveals about those Republicans. After publicly railing against NPR for firing Juan Williams, behind closed doors in a focus group setting, they agreed with NPR and affirmed that NPR had made the correct decision. But not one of those conservatives in government had the courage to say it publicly. Ron's testimony suggests duplicitousness, politicians saying one thing in public to appease their political base, but having completely different opinions in private. I know from watching James O'Keefe's interviews that this is behavior he absolutely detests from politicians.
There's a difference between how politicians project themselves and who they really are. Political corruption. The politicians, the people who pretend to be something they're not. What is it for her to misrepresent herself to the people? Is that not fraud? Change your behavior. Have integrity.
Surprisingly, despite how strongly James feels about this two-faced disingenuousness amongst the political class, in the face of this evidence he's got, which suggests Republicans are doing it, he erases all mention of them and frames it as if the conversation taking place regards an entirely separate group of people, so that those Republicans, who Ron has mentioned, do not risk coming under any scrutiny as a result of James's edited video. Maybe James is correct in his assumption that whenever Ron talks about Republicans, he's just making them up. He's lying that NPR led this focus group with conservative members of government. But how do we know that Ron's not lying about his distaste for Tea Party Republicans? How do we know Ron's not lying about NPR not needing federal funding, as James features elsewhere in his video? It's striking that the comments Ron makes, which James deems to be untrustworthy and therefore not worth broadcasting, happen to be the ones which reflect positively on NPR and negatively on the Republican Party. Moreover, it's striking to observe the extent to which James's editorial judgment affects what goes into the video in general, what is left out, and how the information is presented to the viewer. Requests for biased news coverage which were denied during the conversation are implied to have been acquiesced to by showing incomplete snippets of dialogue. Quotes about Republicans are taken out of context in the video so they can only be interpreted in the least charitable way, or so they cannot be identified as reported speech, and any quotes which implicate the Republican Party are completely removed from the final cut so nobody can tell they're being talked about. For each editing decision, I can imagine James going through a thought process that can be legitimized if you look at things through a certain lens. You know, NPR are biased towards Palestine. Ron was just lying those 6 times when he spoke about their fair news agenda, so it's fair to edit these clips together which imply NPR are biased because that is the actual truth. Ron does hate all conservatives. It's fair to take his quotes out of context because the way I've edited them actually shows the truth of what Ron really thinks. This piece isn't about Republicans, it's about NPR, so there's no need to reference the fact that Ron is talking about Republicans here. But each time this happens, James is abdicating the raw truth of the situation, the raw truth of what he's captured on video, to his own previously formed preconceptions about the people he's filming. The end result is not a process of recording people, broadcasting the things they say behind closed doors, and simply allowing viewers to form their own conclusions, but rather a process of starting with a specific conclusion and then working backwards from there, cherry-picking and editing video clips from a pile of footage to justify the conclusion which has already been formed.
I tell my children there's 2 ways to lie. One is to tell me something that didn't happen, and the other is not to tell me something that did happen. I think that they employed both techniques in this.
Notably, 2011, the year of the NPR sting, was the last year where James published full unedited video recordings alongside his shorter, editorialized Project Veritas clips. It's unclear why exactly James stopped publishing his raw tapes, but what it means for Project Veritas viewers is that they no longer have the option to see discussions in full context. They no longer have the option to find out if anything has been omitted or mischaracterized, perhaps even by accident. It's possible that James has developed much better editorial judgment since 2011 and is now only releasing videos which are completely accurate, not letting any personal biases determine what he shows and what he withholds from viewers. But unfortunately, without James releasing raw tapes for viewers to have a look through alongside his edited videos, no one has any way of knowing this.
My argument is there's only one reality. There's only one truth. It's not like I'm injecting my narrative or opinion in these videos. We're just showing people what people say when no one's looking.
Regarding the NPR sting, I'll just say this. The principle of letting people's own words speak for themselves is only a good one if you're able to stand by the principle when they're saying things that are not convenient or politically expedient for you. If, as soon as you encounter things that don't match what you're looking for, you remove pieces of the puzzle, then you're not letting the words speak for themselves at all. You're rearranging them into your own piece of fiction, and this process is not easily reconcilable with uncovering objective truth. All of that aside, I felt there's another important factor to the NPR sting which explains why someone in James's position might make such misrepresentative editing choices, and it's something which he directly addresses in his book. He writes about how, in the aftermath of the conversation with NPR, his undercover reporters wanted to extend the Muslim Brotherhood sting further and build up to a bigger video. But James writes, "As much as I respected their opinion, there was a central reality I had to contend with. I had financed those limos on my credit card. To maintain any kind of organization and income flow, I needed successes. As Alinsky reminded us, tactics means doing what you can with what you have." This NPR video needed to produce results. At this point in James's career, he'd been employed by Breitbart for just over a year, and in that time, the big media splashes he'd made were for getting arrested and filling up a boat with condoms and lube. If the NPR video failed to produce a substantial media reaction, it's likely that James's entire future career would have hung in the balance. So he did what he could with what he had. framing and contextualizing the content of the NPR video in such a way as to make it the most provocative and impactful to a conservative audience that it could possibly be. The bigger the implications of the video about bias and corruption at NPR, the more attention it would receive, and the more accolades James would get from his own political side for managing to expose it. In short, the incentives for dishonesty were far stronger than those he had for telling the truth.
Awful fall, but niggas wanna stay hot. Bonfire with their friends, ufaya. Say they get into these ends, you liar. Circle jerking, holding hands, kumbaya.
Please indulge me in allowing me to impart one final thought before I close off the vid. The practice of video hacking, splicing into long rolls of footage and broadcasting selective parts of it to push a specific agenda, is not something which is unique to James O'Keefe, or people on the political right. We can look back over the past few years and find plenty of examples of people employing James O'Keefe's exact tactics, often on the left. One example of such a person on the left is Comedy Central show host Jim Jeffries, who did an interview with Avi Yemeni in 2019.
I might sound like a hippie saying this. What gives anyone the right to tell anyone where they can and can't live?
When you import this culture, what do you think is going to happen? Australia's going to end up the same shithole that they came from, that they were escaping.
What gives anyone the right to tell anyone where they can and can't live? Really?
Borders.
I know borders, but wouldn't it just...
Jim Jeffries invested a long time in filming Avi Yemeni, sculpting the conversation to elicit inflammatory responses from him, but then for the finished product he scraped out the context and only used the most controversial clips to depict Yemeni in a specific way. James O'Keefe and Jim Jeffries are completely aligned in their methods here. Both have a goal of embarrassing their target, and in the process they create media which serves as confirmation bias for their audience's political narratives.
What we do is real. The tapes you see, there's never been a case where what you saw wasn't real. I don't report anything unless you can hear and see it come out of the person's own mouth.
Yes, and the Comedy Central recording of Avi Yemeni was real. The words came out of his own mouth. But that doesn't make it truthful. When the words are rearranged, decontextualized, and none of the surrounding context is shown, the medium of video no longer serves as this unfiltered view of reality that James O'Keefe sells it as. The reason why I wanted to bring up the Jim Jeffries counter example is because I think it's interesting to observe how people's reactions to these tactics might differ when they see them being used against their own political side. There's this thing that goes on in our brains where if we dislike the person being framed, we're likely to feel that unethical practices are justified by the end result. Right-wingers might say, so what if NPR were taken out of context? They're elitist liberals, they probably do support the spreading of Sharia law in America. Left-wingers might say, so what if Avi Yemeni was taken out of context? He's a right-wing nationalist, the clips reveal what he's like deep down. The problem that forms here is that whatever strategies we condone being used against our political rivals are the strategies we must also consent to being used on ourselves. And as we've reached an age where video recording is an omnipresent feature of our daily lives, this debate is not as much of an abstract one as it was when James O'Keefe initially started making videos. I'll repeat the prescient quote from The Blaze, which they published in the wake of the Project Veritas NPR video. These are sometimes difficult matters to consider, especially for those who are pleased with the outcomes produced by the release of video reports like this. However, the ethical implications can be significant, and as we say around the Blaze water cooler, the truth has no agenda. Perspective and context are essential elements in bringing truth to the forefront. To exclude or alter them can obscure truths rather than reveal them. A conservative blog, writing at the time of James O'Keefe releasing the NPR recordings, responded to The Blaze like this: I question the motives by websites on the right, like The Blaze, who have misrepresented O'Keefe's revelations and sought to downplay their significance. The video was blockbuster. Whose side are they on, and what is their agenda? I think this quote perfectly encapsulates everything I've just been speaking about. It's not about how journalists arrive at their results, but rather a question of whose side you are on. The early 2010s were formative years for James O'Keefe, where he polished the strategies which would come to define his enterprise and vision for the future of journalism. There were hard times, embarrassments, misfires, but the fact that James was able to rise up from these and turn everything right back around with just one sensational video served as a validation of his disruptive media strategies. In the end, it didn't matter what methods he used or what went wrong in the short term. One big win would always enable him to cancel out the losses. The trajectory of James's early videos serve as testament to the way editorialized narratives travel further and faster than raw, unfiltered truth ever could. And in understanding this, James O'Keefe had set the Project Veritas blueprint to hack the media for years to come.
Somebody had to take the babysitter home. Then I noticed she was sitting on her sweet can. I grabbed her sweet can. Oh, just thinking about her can. I just wish I had her sweet can.
Yes, guys, thanks for watching. I'm very pleased to be able to thank a bigger list of patrons this time after I brought my YouTube channel back from the grave last month. You know the drill, all these people here, fucking sick. I bigly thank them for giving me money to do the thing that I like. Oh yeah, shout out to man like Vadim, aka Creationist Cat, who I identified as someone who would be good at doing an impression of James O'Keefe's voice, and he 100% delivered.
Flawless victory.
Good on him for having the good sense to collaborate with me. On the way out, I've used a Tyler the Creator vocal from the tune Rusty, and right, go listen to that tune now. Go type in Tyler the Creator Rusty on YouTube, yeah? It's a dope beat, it's kind of got this dirty boom bap flex, and Tyler's doing his old era
Wolfgang, I'm a disaffected young man
flex. But I reckon Tyler's vocal over this guitar beat brings out emotions in him, like the inner sorrow that I've always seen as being a fundamental part of Tyler's psyche. Listen to my beat that I'm gonna play, and maybe you will also think this. Or maybe you'll be like, fuck off Timbah, your beat is objectively worse and boring and you're making this outro go on for way too long. Anyway, thanks for watching everyone, and I'll say bye to you now. Bye.
Summer, fall, winter time, 24, 365. You niggas don't give me mine, cause I don't have plenty time. Flying out anytime, getting money, any grind. You niggas gon' give me mine, you niggas gon' give me mine.
In a world where kids my age are popping mollies with leather, sitting on Tumblr, never outside or enjoying the weather. Name a sweater, but not a talent, or don't know if whether or not they got one. Try to change their life for the better. I was a drama club kid, I run with a fun kid. My nuts itched, I was defiant, always said fuck shit. Hated the popular one, now I'm the popular one. Also hated homes too, till I start copying me some. See, I don't bees in the trap, nigga, I bees in the bees. And I be gassing up my plugs like some bees at a shell. Fucking sick and getting bigger like I sneezed on Adele. And bitches getting touchy-feely like they reading some braille. I bust quick like gun holders with short tempers and well. I try to tell the kids like fucking stop being yourself. These fucking rappers got stylists cause they can't think for themselves. See, they don't have an identity, so they needed some help. But really, boy, folks looking silly, boy. I'm in that past season cream shit older than titty, boy. Not a disc, same with ice cream. My shit is Edie Reeves, not Kill Smith. Trans World page 64. Popping like oil ollies and fire flames. I'm harder than DJ Khaled playing a fucking quiet game. The fuck am I saying? Tyler's not even a violent name. I'm about to spreading that stain, windbreakers and hurricanes. But he rapes women and spit wrong like he hate Dennis. Goddamn Dennis, 666 and he's not finished. Shit's missing. He hates women but love kittens. See, y'all niggas tripping, man. Look at that article that says my subject matter is wrong. Saying I hate gays even though Frank is on 10 of my songs. Look at that mom who thinks I'm evil, hold that grudge against me. Though I'm the reason that her motherfucking son got to eat. Look at the kid who had the 9 and tried to blow out his mind. But talk his money, I said hi, I guess I bought him some time. Look at the ones in the crowd, that shit is Barnabas, huh? They thought I wasn't there until I threw a carnival, huh? But then again, I'm an atheist that just worships Satan. And it's probably why I'm not getting no fucking album placements. And MTV could suck my dick and I ain't fucking playing. Or they never played it, I just want shit for they fucking ratings. Analog bands are getting sick of the rates. All the Tron Cap bands are getting sick of the lakes. But what about me, bitch? I'm getting sick of complaints. But I don't hate it when I'm taking daily trips to the bank. Over and over shit, who really gives a fuck? And I think my fans don't, they turning on this shit, they almost extinct. Fuck my studio time, I'ma go purchase a shrink. Record the session and send all you motherfuckers a link, bitch.
Summer, fall, winter time, 24, 365. You niggas gon' give me mine, I don't have plenty time. Flying out at any time, getting money, any grind. You niggas gon' give me mine, you niggas gon' give me mine. Summer, fall, winter time, 24, 365. You niggas gon' give me mine, cause I don't have plenty time. Flying out anytime, getting money, any grind. You niggas gon' give me mine, you niggas gon' give me mine.
Shit just like an ice, I look forward to not remembering so much for being sober. I hope that you can forgive me, but mama, I'm close to the edge. Why don't you jump, you fucking pussy? Seeing is a drop in my ocular, jumping like they told me that the 40's half off, like you know that clue. You need a therapist to tell him he can float that shit. Faggot, compare the fucking pair with all the program kids. This may be a pair of pale bitches for the gonads looking. All of them filling me up and all us not giving no fucks. And all of them sensitive chumps and all when that pistol me back. So I got one and that's something raw till it's rich and cuffed. Bitch, gotta shut the fuck up. Summer, fall, winter time, 24 through 65. You niggas gon' give me mine. I don't have plenty time. Flying out at any time. Getting money, any grind. You niggas gon' give me mine. You niggas gon' give me mine. Summer, fall, winter time, 24 through 65. You niggas gon' give me mine. Cause I don't have plenty time. Flying out anytime. Getting money, any grind. You niggas gon' give me mine. You niggas gon' give me mine.